Okay, good evening, everybody, or good afternoon. My name is Noam Dwarman. I'm doing one of my one-on-one quick interviews here with Michel Paradis, who is a leading human rights lawyer and national security law scholar. He teaches at Columbia University. He had a book out recently called, what was it, Last Mission to Tokyo. About the Japanese in the Second World War. He's a international law expert. He's what I consider to be a reasonable person. He is a man of the left of center, I would say, at least. Although maybe as I've gotten to know him over the last few years, he might be inching a little bit to the right. I don't know, but we'll find out. Anyway, hi, Michelle. How you doing?
Good to see you.
Thanks for doing this.
And I have a new book coming out in June, which is a biography of Dwight Eisenhower called The Light of Battle, just in time for Father's Day. It's almost a quintessential dad book. It's a biography of Dwight Eisenhower that centers on D-Day. So
now Eisenhower, before we get to Eisenhower, is one of these guys who, when I was a kid, he was not considered to have been such a great president by people of my father's ilk who voted for Adlai Stevenson, stuff like that.
Oh, yeah.
Adlai Stevenson. But I think history has been kinder and kinder to him. Is that correct?
Yeah, history and historians, too. There was a ranking of presidents that was done a couple years out of office for him. So it was like in the early Kennedy. I don't think Kennedy was dead yet, or he may have just been killed, but it was in the early 60s. That ranked Eisenhower, I think at the time, at like 38. Right, so bare bottom of the presidential rankings. And the last historian ranking that was done in 2020 put him at 5. So he's definitely, his stock has gone up for historians. And the main reason for that, but I know this interview is not about Dwight Eisenhower.
I was about to ask you that. What's the reason?
But it kind of but there's some related pieces of it that I'm happy to talk more about as we go. But I think two main things happened. One is we got into much more archival material. I think that's been the biggest part. Is Eisenhower had this very concerted effort to look innocuous, right? To sort of brand himself as mayonnaise on white bread, and as a consequence, sold himself as kind of like an aw shucks, just a good old boy from Kansas who was in the army and doing his best, blah, blah, blah. But when you actually get into his private papers, the letters, the minutes of meetings, all the things that you only learn with the benefit of history, the detail, the level of his engagement, his thoughtfulness, his creativity, his sort of just unique insight into the world, his temperament, all that just jumps out at the page. And so he's a much more, he's a very, brilliant, I'm not going to use that word, it's loaded. He's an incredibly smart, highly engaged, deeply thoughtful person who sold himself as like just a yokel. And so it's really taken, I think, historians to sort of peel back the facade that he very carefully built around himself for political reasons, to kind of see how influential and important he really was. So I think that's part of it. And then the other part, which does relate to what we're talking about today, is, it's easy to take all the good things in life for granted, particularly when it comes to history. Mm-hmm. And as we have had more presidents who have dealt with far less crises, with far less, let's just say, success, and sort of like, and much less admirably, whether or not it was, Bill Clinton's time in office, or George W. Bush's treatment of the war on terrorism, obviously even Barack Obama, and I would say Donald Trump, right? We have a contemporary record of presidents dealing with crises that were nothing like the kind of things we dealt with in the 1950s. Like, everything seems terrible to your life, but when you think about, we were on the knife edge of a nuclear war that could end the world at any given time. The fact that the United States did not start an armed conflict in any country throughout the entirety of Dwight Eisenhower's presidency, the fact that he built the infrastructure of this country in ways that we take for granted and are now crumbling because we just haven't kept up with the maintenance of things like the National Highway System, the creation of NASA, and on top of all that, did it with a certain amount of emphasis on individual citizenship and giving people a stake in society, and sort of moving from, what I think moving FDR's New Deal, which risked becoming sort of, as they say, the safety net turning into a hammock, and saying, no, we need a safety net. We need a way of giving people the space to thrive. But we need to let people also thrive for themselves. And so that kind of really small c conservatism and the success with which he was able to implement that, including with a hostile Democratic Congress, right? Even a hostile Republican Party in many respects, demonstrates a level of like political savvy and effectiveness that, frankly, we just haven't really had, certainly in my lifetime. And so I think has given him the ability to rise in stock. His stock has gone up, I think, as a consequence of people really being able to both compare him to his successors and also getting a real sense of how he did what he did in real time.
So two things only, and then we'll get on. One was that there was always a little dissonance in my mind about the Eisenhower rep was because he had commanded all the forces during World War II. So how could he not have been extremely gifted? Right. I mean, that's just never made sense to me. I couldn't even imagine the amount of details and also calm under stress.
Yep.
I mean, talk about having the weight of the world on your shoulders.
He literally beat Hitler. Like that's actually like part of his resume. He led the invasion of Europe.
So this is a real testament to how partisanship will always just warp people's minds, that as soon as he becomes a partisan figure, oh, he's an idiot. Wait a second, he just beat Hitler. You know, you might disagree with him on policies, but he's probably not an idiot. The second thing that comes to mind is that what you describe is similar to Reagan, who, again, whether you agree with his policies or not, it's not the point. He was always described in my lifetime as a dunce until they got a hold of his diaries and his papers and his handwritten speeches, you know, that he'd written without ghostwriters. And then people had to say, oh, well, he wasn't quite what we had said he was. Now, I'm not expecting someday to find Trump's handwritten papers and find out that he was.
We have them already. It's called Twitter.
Coffee or whatever that's. So right. I'm not saying that you could generalize that, but people should.
Trump is also look. I'll give the devil his due. Trump is a lot smarter and savvier than most of his opponents understand. George W. Bush was the same way. I don't think they're even remotely, in terms of temperament, intellect, or accomplishment, in the league of someone like Dwight Eisenhower. Yeah. But there is, as you say, a partisan interest in flattening the skill set of political figures. And there is another, just basic fact, I think, about American politics, certainly 20th century American politics, where there is a great deal to be politically gained by being folksy. And part of that is because of Eisenhower. FDR did that too, which is often forgotten, but the whole George W. Bush, like, oh, shucks, I just like being out clearing brush in the woods, is a shtick that presidents have, thoroughly embraced. Successful presidents have thoroughly embraced. And unsuccessful candidates have resisted violently, whether or not it's Al Gore running against George W. Bush. Adlai Stevenson is sort of the case of that. I would even say a lot of Barack Obama's deep unpopularity with significant parts of the country, which seems inexplicable because he's kind of he wasn't a particularly significant president. You can like him or dislike him, but I'm just saying, like, the amount he put on his plate, the kind of things he reached for were not, he wasn't reaching for the stars.
Well, national health care was a big deal, no?
But even that, it was like national health care insurance reform. It wasn't, I'm just saying, like, Bill Clinton went out and was like, yeah, we're going to give everybody a Medicaid for all or Medicare for all. You know what I mean? So, like, Barack Obama just was a much more modest political figure, is all I mean to say by that. It's not. I don't mean it as a slight. It's just his ambitions were way narrower than really both his predecessors and successors. But he had that kind of smartest kid in class vibe that I think just viscerally turned a lot of people off, because I think there's something in contemporary American politics that likes the who do you want to go have a beer with question. Even if George W. Bush doesn't actually drink, he seemed like he'd be more fun to watch a game with than Al Gore. And people don't like smarty pants.
I was, we're really off the subject, but I was,
we can cut all this out.
But I was thinking about something, when you hear about, it's reminding me what you just said, when we hear about how left-wing academia is. So one instinct would be to say, well, that might just be evidence that the smartest people understand that left-wing things are correct. Like, why would you think that it should be diverse that way? Maybe just the smarter people understand the truth. But then it occurred to me, and it's sort of related to what you just said. I know a lot of super smart people, high IQ people, I'm sure a higher IQ than many, many professors, who are not left-wing. They're very well informed, and they completely disagree with this stuff. So then it occurred to me, well, maybe there's a certain personality on top of IQ power that's drawn to academia, who wants to sit there and poke holes at things and find these novel interpretations that are not really related to the real world. The smartest kid in the class vibe. It doesn't mean you're the smartest kid in the class.
No.
It's you enjoy. That's your vibe. You enjoy that, and that seems to be maybe why so much about. And you see that in academia. You see it now in journalism. It's. I hate being old. I hate the fact that I'm 60. It's killing me. But there is wisdom of experience, and I do remember that the journalists, when I was a kid, were rough and tumble everyday guys. Jimmy Breslin, they'd been in the army. They were drinking. They were cut from a completely different cloth than the Ezra Kleins and these. I don't want to insult these people, but you know what I'm talking about.
I know exactly what you mean. Yeah, there has been. Like, journalism used to be a dirty business, and it became, really thanks to, I think, people like Bob Woodward more than anything else, became kind of a romantic profession for the literary class. Because it used to be just a harder distinct. I think there was also more opportunities to be literary, right? And those don't really exist outside of journalism now. Like, you can't really make a living being a literary writer anymore, the way like Norman Mailer or something like that could have. And then people like Bob Woodward made being a journalist like this romantic, highbrow kind of thing to do. Often forgetting how lowbrow Carl Bernstein was, right? Carl Bernstein was like the traditional beat reporter, and did a lot of the actual reporting.
Immortalized by Robert Redford, but okay. Right.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Like, who doesn't want to be cast as Robert Redford in a? Dustin Hoffman was Carl Bernstein, by the way.
Oh, did I get it backwards? I thought.
Yeah. Redford was Woodward, which was
okay. Oh, okay. I had that backwards.
So yeah, no, I think that's all right. But yeah, sorry, we're getting way off topic.
Yeah. So international law. I'm always, of course, having gone to law school, one learns in law school that the judges, that's often their job. They have to rewrite and interpret laws all the time because laws are unclear, because if a law leads to an obviously unfair outcome, that probably can't be right. So the judges will rewrite the law. So the whole notion of international law that, I don't know when was the Geneva Conventions? When were they?
The modern ones are 49 and then 77 are the.
Okay. So, they take their best estimate of what they think. But of course, criminal law is written and rewritten over centuries to try to react to every scenario that couldn't have been thought of. International law is very broad brush, and in my mind is trying to reflect morality as best it can, and trying to contemplate what nations might be up against and how they should be moral. So having said that, I've always been somewhat skeptical of it, but still I would like to know what international law says and what it doesn't. So one of the things we hear over and over now, and I played you the clip by Francesca Albanese, I don't know how to pronounce her name.
The right of self-defense can be invoked when a state is threatened by another state, which is not the case. Israel has not claimed that has been threatened by another state. It's been threatened by an armed group. Qualify it the way you want, but it's an armed group within the occupied territory. And frankly, even saying the war between Gaza and Israel is wrong, because Gaza is not a standalone entity, it's part of the occupied territory. But so, in particular, Israel cannot claim the right of self-defense against a threat that emanates from the territory it occupies, from a territory that is kept under belligerent occupation.
But she makes the point over and over that Israel has no self-defense rights in this conflict because it is the occupier. And I had this argument with Aaron Mate from the Gray Zone, and his way he explained it was that Israel certainly can defend itself when Hamas invades, but then if Hamas retreats the other side of the line, Israel can't follow them. And then if they come back the next day, Israel can defend, but then just has to take it every single day. So what is that?
Okay,
Does Israel have no self-defense rights here?
Okay, so there are a couple. So I'm not 100% clear on what Aaron Mate's.
I'll leave Aaron out of it.
But I'll just going off the clip you showed me of the special rapporteur.
Aaron is not part of this answer. Go ahead.
Sure. So no, I think that's wrong, and I'll give you a couple of different reasons why that's wrong. And I'll sort of point out, because as you said, look, international law is a much less well-defined body of law than certainly the criminal regulatory codes of New York City. But there are laws and principles there. And so the big problem you often see with international lawyers, and I'm sure I've fallen into this, but you get very definitive statements about the law is this when typically, or on a lot of very difficult, important questions, international law just doesn't actually answer the question. And so it speaks in such broad terms that to give like a hard and fast answer is reckless, frankly, or just not scholarly. It's not lawyerly, if nothing else. It may be worth winning an argument, but it's not lawyerly in the sense of taking the law seriously. So as I understood the position of the special rapporteur, she had two basic ideas there, neither of which I think are correct, frankly, or at least both are deeply contestable, I think is a better way of saying it. The first is that there is no right of self-defense against non-state actors, which was her first and I think primary line of argument. That there's no inherent right of self-defense. So international law talks about two kinds of self-defense principles. One is the collective self-defense that you have in treaties like the NATO Charter, like Article 5 of the NATO Charter, where the members of NATO can declare their mutual defense obligations in a particular situation. That's happened one time in the history of the NATO Charter, and it was in response to the attack on September 11th. So right there, you have a pretty massive example of what in international law terms is called state practice. How do states actually implement these international legal obligations that they have? Because that tells us what they mean. Because you don't have judicial organs with the same kind of reach and power and sort of regularity that you have in all sorts of other contexts. So you look to how states actually act as a way of interpreting what they are, what the law is, right? It's custom. If you think about it as customary international law to some extent, but even with written law, you look to custom to define how those customs are, or what those words mean. And so as sort of basic law principles, the only time Article 5 collective self-defense implication has been invoked has been in response to a non-state actor. So the idea that self-defense does not reach non-state actors is literally running against the only significant example of self-defense being unequivocally invoked by various states without any sort of contest, right? Everyone agrees that was an act of self-defense. The United States is attacked by Al-Qaeda, a non-state actor. So I still think it has any support from that standpoint. The other concept of self-defense you see, again, is this sort of mix of customary and conventional law, and it's Article 51 of the United Nations Charter, which says that military action is essentially, I'm summarizing here, so I apologize if I stumble a bit, but I'm trying to keep it in intelligible terms. And
by the way, afterwards you can send me a link to whatever it is, and I can include that in the package with all this.
Yeah. So Article 51 of the basically the premise of the United Nations Charter is that countries can't go to war with each other. And the major exception to that are twofold. One is if the Security Council authorizes it. So when the United States and the coalition invaded Iraq in 1990 in the Gulf War, that was pursuant to an express UN authorization to essentially expel Iraq from Kuwait because they had violated the UN Charter by invading another member state, a sovereign state. So that's the one and main way that the UN Charter contemplates military force is going to be used, with the permission, in essence, of the Security Council. The second way, which is part of what's called Article 51 of the United Nations Charter, speaks to what's called the inherent right of self-defense. Self-defense in other languages is actually described as legitimate defense. It would be the way you would translate it, because those are legal concepts that are, more or less sort of specific. Self-defense is a legal concept that's kind of quite specific to the Anglo-American legal system, but legitimate defense exists everywhere and is basically the same as what we think of as self-defense. It just has sort of grayer edges. The edges are gray, depending on what legal system you're looking for. And so Article 51 says, again, you can't, the whole charter is built around you can't go to war without Security Council authorization, except that when an armed attack occurs, or depending on the translation from the French, it says when a country is subject to aggression, they retain the legitimate, the inherent right is what it's called, to legitimate / self-defense, the inherent right to self-defense. So that tells you two things. One is that even the UN Charter system, which is built around the idea that sovereign states, nation states, member states of the United Nations can't go to war with each other without Security Council approval, recognizes that states can respond directly militarily to another state, like Ukraine to Russia, when they're subject to aggression. But the framing of Article 51 is also important because it doesn't refer to, self-defense means this. It says there is an inherent right of self-defense, i.e. a concept of sovereign self-defense, the right to protect your territory and your people, that pre-exists the UN Charter itself, and that the Charter of the United Nations is specifically not abrogating.
It's like an inalienable right. It's like it's a basic moral precept.
Exactly. Like if you think about the U.S. Constitution, right? The U.S. Constitution has provisions like the Bill of Rights, specifically Amendment 9 and Amendment 10, both of which refer to rights that the states and the people hold, generally, right, without actually specifying them, that are not abrogated by the Constitution more generally. And that, again, operates from the presumption that certain powers adhere to sovereignty that predate the agreement, right? Because that's all the UN Charter, and same with the Constitution. It's all it is, right? It's a contract, in essence. It's a convention that predate them. And so in talking about what is and is not in the inherent right of self-defense, I honestly don't even know what she's drawing upon, the idea that you have to attack another member state of the United Nations. Clearly that's illegal if you attack another member state of the United Nations under the UN Charter. And but you still have self-defense rights in that context, but it doesn't mean that that's the only self-defense right you have, right? You have a broad, general, sort of, again, pre-UN Charter right to self-defense that is not given up by the Charter itself. And so to the extent a non-state actor, a foreign non-state actor, whether or not it's the Barbary pirates or space aliens or you name it, are presenting a fundamental attack on the sovereign integrity of a country, you retain as a government the ability to respond to that threat in a meaningful way, because you have, again, the sort of pre-UN Charter sovereign right to defend you and your people. And so just as a legal matter, just on the sort of like nuts and bolts of the kind of legal case that's being laid out, I think in a fairly glib fashion, frankly, in her statement, I just don't think she's right from again, nuts and bolts, how you analyze international legal questions in an ordinary way. One, because self-defense has, in the only times we've had any, again, clear examples of self-defense being invoked, and everyone recognizes that, have involved non-state actors, i.e. Al-Qaeda. And to then also further say that self-defense, means this very hyper-technical thing involving the UN Charter is just wrong, because that's not even how the UN Charter itself is written. And so that the right of self-defense is, there are strong reasons to believe that the right of self-defense is significantly broader than any sort of like question about state-on-state abrogation of the UN Charter.
But what about this notion of occupier? Now,
sure.
To me, yeah. So to me, obviously, I would think that the French who were occupied by the Nazis in the 40s, they were clear victims. Forget about how they might have collaborated. They're clear victims. So, they would have certain rights to constantly defend themselves. But not all occupations are the same. Occupying a place that was taken in a clear war of aggression and annexation is different than occupying a place that was taken when the occupying power was attacked. And B, it would have to matter, like if I'm always, I'm thinking analogously to criminal law where intention matters. It would matter a great deal whether or not the party being occupied was demanding a peaceful settlement or was actually still clinging to its rights to make war on the occupier and wants to see the occupier wiped off the face of the earth forever, meaning that there's no good way for the occupier to leave. And this kind of technical description of what the legal rights are, it makes a mockery to me of the whole notion of the law, which is supposed to be deeply wise and just. It's not supposed. That's what people hate about the law, is this notion that it's just this, technical thing where everybody gets off on loopholes and stuff like that. But that's not actually the way the law works. It seldom works that way. That's one of the lessons I got in law school. Is actually, oh wow, the law is actually much more fair and much more deep than people shallowly want to describe it. So, having said all that, what are the rights of occupiers and the occupied in this context?
So I would make 2 points. One in response to, again, sort of like her fairly casual alighting over a few things, but I'll just sort of point them out again. Just less to sort of say she's unquestionably clearly wrong or lying or misleading or not understanding the law, and more just saying, look, certain questions of international law are just way more ambiguous and unresolved. And so when you start thinking about how to resolve them, sometimes international law just doesn't have a lot to say on a particular subject. And so I think one of the ones that is vexing to a lot of people, has been for a while, is the precise status of Gaza, certainly since the Israeli withdrawal. Right, Gaza was certainly part of the occupied territory after 1967, because the Israelis invaded Egypt. Some would say illegally, some would say in self-defense. That's sort of one of the great debates over self-defense that we've had in international law over the past 20 years.
Can we just pause on that for 1 second? Because I know that some would say that Israel pretextually invaded Egypt, but the closing of the straits is a legal cause for war, right? How do you pronounce it? Casus belli?
I don't want to go deep on the 1967 war.
Okay.
I just use it as an example of when, 1967 is one of the great sort of debates about who was acting in self-defense, right? Which gets to how nuanced things about Article 51.
But that's vis-a-vis Egypt. What's not in dispute is that Jordan attacked Israel.
Right. So, I'm just saying, what was again, these are sort of the great debates within international law over the nuances of Article 51.
But it is interesting, and most people don't realize that you can debate Gaza because Gaza was taken in this preemptive attack on Egypt, even though Egypt wouldn't take it back, which is also part of the
right.
Camp David.
And so exactly.
But the West Bank, people don't realize, was taken in a defensive war. So if you want to understand the whole, how did Israel come into the West Bank? It's not actually the same as Gaza. If it matters to you that Israel illegally attacked Egypt, then, illegally might actually change it. But if it matters to you that Israel preemptively attacked Egypt, then if you want to be consistent, it has to matter to you that actually Israel was attacked by Jordan. Go ahead.
Sure. Yeah. And I don't want to completely unwind the 1967 war and Israel's expansion of the Golan Heights.
We have 10 minutes. Go ahead. Do it.
Okay, exactly. It is that so Gaza was part of Egypt, the West Bank was part of Jordan, and the Golan Heights were part of Syria. And the Israel sort of expands in the course of the 1967 and 1973 wars to essentially obtain occupation status over these territories. Now, the one of the vexing things about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is that the original, quote, owners, the sovereign owners of Gaza and the West Bank no longer claim them. And so what is Gaza and the West Bank? They're kind of sui generis. This is an imperfect analogy, but it's like a territorial dispute over the Sahara Desert or the moon or territorial waters, right? These are areas that, as a matter of international law, if we're just being honest, the precise legal status of that land and who owns, quote unquote, that land is just not clearly determined by extant international law. However, because Israel's presence in Gaza and the West Bank, Golan for that matter, were acquired in the course of an international armed conflict, i.e. a conflict between two state parties, right? Egypt, Jordan, Syria. That now triggers things like the Fourth Geneva Convention from 1949, which governs how countries administer territories that they acquire in the course of what's called belligerent occupation. And belligerent occupation is literally just what it sounds like. We go to war, my army comes over your territory, I'm now governing your territory. What rights and responsibilities do I have to that territory vis-a-vis the people who are already there? That's the law of belligerent occupation. And so from at least 1967 up through at least 2006, Israel was a belligerent occupant of the Gaza Strip, even though what precisely legal underlying status, who owns the Gaza Strip, has always been an ambiguous fact, right? It's just not something that's determined clearly by international law. And the nuance, the wrinkle comes in the fact that the Israelis withdrew from Gaza, unilaterally withdrew from Gaza, but then quarantined it off. And so you've had a lot of legal debate over, okay, well, what is Gaza now? Because Israel claims no responsibility for it, doesn't claim the powers to govern it, doesn't claim the powers to build roads, to do anything for that matter, and has used its military power exactly the same way as Egypt has to essentially quarantine off Gaza from its own territory for what Israel claims are national security needs. I don't want to debate whether or not that's a justifiable or reasonable or even effective way of doing that, but that's Israel and Egypt's position, is that the Gaza Strip is this kind of sui generis territory of ungoverned, sort of non-state territory in which millions of Palestinians live in relatively close confinement, and Israel and Egypt have essentially embargoed it or quarantined it with a combination of sort of just military presence, literal walls that have surrounded Gaza for much of that time, and lots of checkpoints where they control, because they physically can control, what goes in and out of the Gaza Strip for their own claimed national security interests. A similar quarantine was put in place when the United States, by the United States against Cuba during the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? We basically used boats, and any ship going into Cuba, we stopped that boat to make sure there were no nuclear weapons parts, et cetera, on it. And so I don't think it's, frankly, legally accurate or clearly beyond debate that Israel has maintained the status of occupier, or that Gaza is part of any occupied territories, at least prior to the current war, when now Israel is back in Gaza, operating, essentially supplanting any sort of civil infrastructure and government they might have. And now Israel is occupying the Gaza Strip under, I would say, probably again, Article 4, Geneva Convention, the Fourth Geneva Convention. And so the idea that, a state can't, first of all, I just don't agree with her characterization of what self-defense is and the scope of self-defense in any context. But the idea that because it's occupied territory, that there is no self-defense, that there's some sort of special self-defense right or lack of self-defense, I just also don't think that's accurate, because prior to, again, the most recent war, I don't think it's legally uncontrovertible that Gaza is occupied. You can say it's constructively been occupied by Egypt and Israel jointly, because they're exercising an extreme amount of control over the territory. I think that's it's not an unreasonable argument, but to say it's equivalent to the West Bank is just wrong.
Let's take it for the sake of argument, because I could see that it's constructively occupied. Let's just say for the sake of argument, Gaza is occupied. Now October 7th happens and rockets continue to come in to this day. Can it be possible that Israel has no right of self-defense? I mean,
No, so even under the law of belligerent occupation, assume that Israel actually did continue for all this time to essentially govern Gaza, which is what belligerent occupation is. Then of course it can use military force to assert security prerogatives, right? It has to be very careful about that. These are civilians, it's dense. Like, I'm not justifying any one thing that Israel is or has done, because I think, I mean, there is at least some indication that they should be a lot more careful than they've been, at least in certain texts. And I don't want to get too deep into those because I don't frankly know enough, and I don't think anyone really knows enough right now to make hard judgments.
But a whole lot of people are dying for sure.
But a whole lot of people are dying. They're using very heavy artillery. They're dropping 2,000-pound bombs in a very confined quarter.
And there is, and I'll play devil's advocate, and there is some indication, to the extent that it's sincere, that within the Biden White House, and there's nobody more who's been more inclined to support Israel than the Biden White House, it seems that some people within that White House think that they've been overzealous in certain decisions. So
right, and again, I want to just be careful in saying anything because I don't frankly know enough, and I'm willing to have sort of the epistemic humility.
I also always worry that there's some good cop, bad cop going on there for political reasons. That's why I don't know, but I'm certainly open, as pro-Israel as I am. I'm certainly not going to sign a blank check that everything they're doing is
right. And so but the idea that you can't, in a belligerent occupation, use military force to subdue hostile elements in the population is literally like, that's the opposite of belligerent occupation, right? It's called belligerent occupation. It's a war. It's understood that the occupying power is in a state of war with the local population. That does not give them license to be indiscriminate. That doesn't give them license to treat every military-age male as a potential combatant. That doesn't give them license to drop heavy artillery to displace the population. There are all sorts of things that Israel undertakes by being an occupier to protect the civilian population. That doesn't excuse anything. But the idea that you can't use military force to suppress hostile elements when you are literally belligerently occupying something as a matter of international law, again, that's just not right. It's not correct as a matter of law. We can talk about the morality, the ethics of it, and I think those can be very sincere debates. But I think there's often a tendency, particularly in areas of international law, to conflate what is moral and desirable with what the law either compels or forbids. And I just think unfortunately, that's wrong. Maybe we want better laws, but you have to remember the law of war presupposes war, right? The law of war presupposes mass violence, murder, and destruction. And it's built to essentially saw off the harshest edges of that and to protect the civilian population as much as possible. But you are in a situation where you're dealing with war, and war is violent, it's cruel, and we have to be, I think, clear-eyed about that and not say that everything we don't like or that offends us, even in a moral and even correctly morally, is necessarily illegal, because that's just not how international law is built.
So let me, maybe you can guide me here. I'm going to try to speak, openly here. I was born by an accident of birth, Jewish, in New York at this time. I know that, people born Palestinian support the Palestinian cause, and people born Iranian support the Iranian cause. So I'd have to be completely without self-awareness to not notice the coincidence that these things I happen to be right happen to be coincide with the accidents of my own birth. Well, isn't that convenient, right? But on the other hand, somebody has to be right. So it's not enough to say that I'm wrong because of that. So, and people cry wolf. Every victim class cries wolf all the time. I hear Jews complain anti-Semitism. Like somebody criticizes George Soros, they say it's anti-Semitism. Trump says makes a joke to some business leaders, it's anti-Semitism. You name it, it's anti-Semitism, right? So I definitely don't ever want to be one of those people who cry wolf. And one of the things Jews say all the time is that the world hates them and the United Nations is a completely anti-Semitic outfit. So now I see this woman, this international lawyer representing the UN, say to me, well, No, occupiers have no right, so therefore Israel has to take it. And I'm saying to myself, okay, this woman has a sophisticated knowledge of the situation. What she's saying is that the rockets should be able to come in. And of course, Israel happens to have the Iron Dome, but let's say Israel didn't have the Iron Dome. There's no Iron Dome exception to the international laws. So the rockets are supposed to be able to come in. Israel has no right to defend itself. Supposedly, it's supposed to deoccupy and turn it over to the people sending the rockets, who are sworn to the destruction of Israel from the river to the sea. And she'll glibly dismiss the moral right of parents to defend their children. Like it would take her 2 seconds to look at this and say, well, this is a tough situation. But there's not even a hint in her body language that she even gives a shit about it. She's like, oh, occupiers have no rights. Next case, bangs the gavel. So it seems like she'd be perfectly okay with the logical outcome of what she's saying, which is go slaughter the Jews until they deoccupy, in which case you can slaughter them even more easily. And to not even betray some evidence of weighing this, of struggling with this obviously difficult situation. I understand very well. Maybe I don't express it enough, but I try to express it enough. But I had a conversation with my wife today about it. We're parents. These children in Gaza are dying. I can't imagine that. Every parent knows. How can these, again, by the accident of birth, these poor people, whatever, so every time I want to say, Israel should do whatever it has, I have to stop myself. But, it can't just do whatever it wants, because people are dying. And every moral person at least shows an indication that when they make a pronouncement that is going to mean death in the balance, that they're at least struggling with it. And then you when I see her and I see no sign of that, even this kind of like smug, almost half smiling way in which she's looking, I'm so clever, she's delivering it. I can't help it. I feel they hate the Jews. I don't know what else to say when I see that, because I know it's so far from the way I would express that. Even if I agreed with it, I would understand that what I'm saying is profoundly impactful to the people I'm disagreeing with. I would indicate that I understand that. I get it. Nothing. So what? I mean, am I wrong about that?
Yeah, I would make maybe 2 points. Is one, and kind of both sort of focusing on that clip actually, is like one is she doesn't speak for she's not the UN Secretary General, right? She is the UN Special Rapporteur for the occupied territories in Palestine. So
right, but the UN makes a decision to hire a hack advocate of it, rather than trying to hire like a Goldstone or somebody who clearly has a judicious temperament.
Yeah, and that's fair. I'm not necessarily defending that aspect, but I'm just saying she has a portfolio. She has an interest in the same way that if you were interviewing the head of the EPA, they would have a very strong view of environmental regulations, or head of the IRS is going to have a very strong view of tax enforcement. That and even one-sided view of that, you got to kind of like. I'm just putting that in perspective. I'm saying that not as an excuse, but just sort of as an explanation as to why she may be especially strident. But I think actually the thing that, and maybe I'm repeating myself, but I think the thing that kind of bothered me most about that clip, and I say this again, I'm not Jewish, I'm not Palestinian, I'm Roman Catholic and French and British, right? So we have a long history of being hated by pretty much everyone for not terribly, for pretty good reasons, I would say. But so like I don't feel like I have a dog in this fight the same way, at least emotionally, that a lot of people do, other than the human one. When I see the suffering of, Palestinian children and doctors, my wife's a doctor, and so I can empathize a lot with the Palestinian doctors who are like constantly worrying about their hospitals being knocked offline. Just because of the natural professional and human care for their patients and all that. And by the same token, I have tremendous like sympathy and compassion for like the the Israeli kids who just went to a rave, and these like psychopaths come raging in like a horde, and like this is I haven't seen anything like this since Rwanda.
Allegedly came right.
Well, right.
People are denying it now. I'm kidding. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, fine. I mean, again, you can't try and convince the people whose literal identity depends on not being convinced. But
right.
I think as a person of conscience, as a person who just tries to see the world in as human a term as possible. Like you look at all this suffering and it's crazy. And I think one of the things that bothered me actually most about her clip is the kind of glibness of it, is the sort of self-satisfied quality of it. And again, and this may be just a professional thing on my part, is the effort to clothe what are, political arguments, fine, make them. Persuade people of them. Even moral arguments, fine, persuade people of them. But they're not legal arguments. And I think, the United States is sort of notorious, people in the United States are notorious for this. But international law is rife with this, where people sort of declare international law they use the frame of international law, the language of international law as a cudgel to say that what I'm saying is beyond reproach, that I have no obligation to persuade you of the rightness of my position, when international law just doesn't cover that much territory. What international law both permits and forbids is way narrower and way more sort of brutal than what I think most people are even willing to accept. And I think when we try and over-legalize arguments of both morality and policy, that creates these these unreconcilable arguments, because people are like, well, this is what law says. No, this is and that's frankly an inane argument, right? There's nothing more boring than listening to lawyers argue about what the law is. But I also think it lets people off the hook, even from themselves, to be able to think carefully about the moral, political, and just social consequences of what they're actually advocating for. And
I would just say,
and I'm not going to both sides of this, although that's what this is going to sound like. But in the same way where you have these, chest thumping, sort of members of Benjamin Netanyahu's cabinet saying, we have a right to defend ourselves, we're going to do. Like, I get that, but that also doesn't mean you can drop, 2,000-pound bombs onto hospitals, right? There are limits. There are legal limits, but there are also, more importantly, moral limits.
It may or may not mean they can drop 2,000 bombs on the hospital.
No, but I think that, again, I'm not trying to both sides it and what about is
no,
it.
I don't think you are.
Those are inane arguments, frankly. But I do think anytime people resort when you get these sort of, frankly, shallow international legalistic arguments, I think it's because people are unwilling or unable to argue on the merits of what they're talking about.
So let me give you two comments, and then we almost wrap it up. The first thing is, if I were head of the UN, I would say, get that woman out of here, because what she's really doing is undermining the very concept of international law. Because if they're going to start using international law to make the point, which everybody knows can't be right, that a nation just has to sit there and be killed, and then can't chase the other people back over the line, and can't even take out rocket launchers on the other side of the line. So we just have to take incoming fire indefinitely. If that's what international law means, then people are very quickly going to come to the conclusion, fuck international law. This is a meaningless concept. So to the extent that they want, and if the UN doesn't want this, nobody wants it. If they want international law to be respected and move towards a future where it has more and more hold on the decisions of nations, they can't present it as this ridiculous pie-in-the-sky set of rules that leads to outrageously and obviously immoral conclusions. That's number one. Number two, what was my number two? The notion of the hospitals is a very troubling one, and the whole human shields thing altogether. So if Hamas builds tunnels under a hospital and is using them for profound or profoundly important, for operations which, if they were to cease, would significantly undermine their war effort, strategically important, then it is almost impossible still to tell you, go ahead, drop a 2,000-ton bomb on the whatever that measurement was, 2,000-pound bomb on the hospital. That's an emotional response. I have it too. So then I try to say, what is the game theory of that, and what am I really seeing? Well, the game theory of that would be then, well, from the future, every single bad actor in the world would know, well, if you build all your military stuff in the hospital, that's, so that can't be right. And the other thing, another way to look at it, is imagine, okay, well, let's say Hamas built a military base, and then the war started, and Hamas went to the hospital and gathered all the patients and brought them to the military base and put them in a pen. It's still taking care of them. That would be the same thing. It would be the exact same thing. But it's somehow in that case, people would say, well, of course Israel has to bomb them. They can't just bring the patients in and expect Israel not to bomb them. But constructively and morally and in every way, they're exactly the same thing. If Hamas brings its infrastructure to the hospital, or if it brings its hospital defensively to the infrastructure, it's the same immoral act. And all I could say in Israel's behalf, and as you've told me, there's civilians in the room and lawyers in the room, but there's also a lot of rage and a lot of anger in the room. I just hope, and we'll only know in retrospect, that if they do this kind of thing, they really had to do it. That it really was essentially, unless we do this, we will not be able to prosecute this war. And, war, it's like we're all learning stuff that I guess maybe you historians knew for a long time, but, I've never really grappled with it like I am now, just how fucking awful war is. Every war's looked like this, right? I mean, this is not unusual. Wars have been much worse than this, actually. But now we're seeing it on our phones, and we can't look at it, and we can't comprehend it. And we're so fortunate in America, we really can't comprehend it. I don't know what you want to say about all that, but it's very deep time.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. It's we have been, war has always been way worse than it is now. And it's hard to fathom when you see the amount of sort of brutality and cruelty and suffering, whether or not it's in, Gaza or in Ukraine or, in Sudan, right? We have, what they sort of casually call hotspots all around the world. I would, if I took you in a time machine 100 years ago, it would turn you white because of just sort of the fundamental brutality of war, which is why prior generations, and particularly people, again, I don't mean this as a book plug, I promise you, but people like Dwight Eisenhower, who literally was a general, right? He was a military general who was personally responsible for the death of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. And he was the only president we've had in quite some time who didn't start a war. And I don't think those two things are coincidental. It's because he knew exactly what that meant. And he did. This isn't just like a speculation. He really did know exactly what that meant. And he thought it was his primary obligation to avoid war at all costs because of, we, especially today, think of war in, I think, almost anodyne terms of like drones, right? Robots and or fictionalized war that we watch on television or on video games. But when you actually get into the smell of it and the dirt under your fingernails and you see the suffering up close, it's not just a meme. These are real people who are suffering and they're dying, and it's brutal. And so we should do everything we can to avoid war under as many, and if not every circumstance that we can. And I think that's one of the sort of, in a way, almost failings of international law, in that it gives people, I think, a false assurance of order where there isn't any. And when people, again, resort to these ideas, it's legal or illegal, what they're really saying is right or wrong, but without grappling with, why it's right or wrong, or the weight of that.
Did international law ever contemplate the notion of a nation whose war aim is to have its civilians die? This is. I mean, the Hamas leadership,
yeah, of course,
they've said this.
Of course it did.
It did?
Japan, right? Like Japan, had a military camp. The Japanese military had a policy of not surrendering. They fought to the death. That's why there were very, very few Japanese prisoners of war. It made the fighting in places like Okinawa and Peleliu and God knows where incredibly brutal because they literally fought to the last man.
Wait, but that's not what I meant. I meant my read on this is that Hamas has no military objective when it's firing rockets now. It's not trying to take territory. It's not actually a war like we're used to, where like Ukraine and Russia are actually both have some notion that they can push the other army back and take this plot of land, occupy. Hamas when Hamas is firing rockets now, they are trying to draw fire, and they're trying to draw fire to have their civilians killed, because that is how they are succeeding in this war of world support.
Yeah.
And
they're using
that,
asymmetric warfare principles.
yeah, and that is so Hamas, wants its people to die more than Israel wants its people to die. They don't spend a single dime on civil defense. I mean, there's no indication. Right, today in the news, Israel created some safe areas apparently for people to go to. Hamas is now firing rockets from the newly established safe areas. Now, why would they do that? It's obvious why, because they want to draw fire to the safe areas. International law breaks because there's a certain assumption in the law that people are operating from the interest of protecting themselves and not dying themselves. If the country being attacked has the aim of having its civilians die, the other country is not going to succeed at not having the civilians die.
So again, like everything that's old is new again. Certainly the Vietnamese did a lot of that.
I don't know.
And we were completely reckless in how we bombed Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia, right? It was utterly shocking by any contemporary standard. And
you were not mourning Kissinger's recent death?
Mourning, like it was morning. But the idea that the Vietnamese didn't know what they were doing, I disagree with that. They were strategically incredibly intelligent. They had a very savvy finger on the pulse of world public opinion, U.S. public opinion. Right? None of these things are new, and that's one of the reasons why. And I don't mean to harp on this point, but it's one of the reasons why international law doesn't govern as much as you think, because people understand that there's a lot of fucked up shit in the world. And the law will not save us from all that fucked up shit.
All right, we got to wrap it up. You want to give me one last little encapsulation that I can put as about occupiers' rights, or not? Or you just want to end it here? You have any summation or no?
More fucked up than you think. I don't know if that's a good closer. I think I think we have to stop looking to law as the mediator for what are fundamentally moral and policy questions. Because law is by nature zero sum. You have winners and losers. It's legal or illegal. And the world is just way more complicated than I think the law, that thinking in legalistic terms, allows us. It's blinding, frankly, to our ability to understand the world, understand the people we're trying to either negotiate with or even fight with. So I think anytime you see someone reaching immediately to use legal terms to defend their side of the argument, at least be skeptical, because if they're talking about international law, it's most likely going to be a much more ambiguous question, or at least more ambiguous answer than they presented. And I think it also hurts international law because there are certain parts of international law that are very clear, and that the more you soften international law's edges to win policy arguments, you're weakening the core of international law, whether or not it's the prohibition on torture, whether or not it's the emphasis that the law of war puts on proportionality, so that that you're actually defeating the very purposes that the law has. But the law's purposes isn't resolving every argument. The law's purposes is making sure that we do our best not to just devolve into the worst kinds of barbarism that humanity has always devolved into. And you can go back 100 years, you can go back 1,000 years. It's way worse if you live in a world that lacks humanity and lacks legal controls. And so thinking about those things carefully and using those words, using particularly the words of law, the way they were intended, I think is a better way of reaching a humane and rational result that people will be behind than just willy-nilly saying that's illegal or that's lawful or coming up with weird cockamamie theories that frankly have no support even under the terms that they're made.
All right, Michelle, I really appreciate you taking the time. If you come across anybody in your travels who, that you respect, who has a different opinion on this than you do, someone who might agree more with Francesca Albanese, certainly let them know. I'd be interested to have them on to present a different perspective on it.
Who could disagree with me? I don't think that's even.
No, I used to disagree with you, but lately I haven't been able to disagree with you on stuff. All right, see you around the club soon, I hope.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, thanks again.
Bye.
Bye.